Hi, I'm Rhiannon from the Epsom Bakehouse, and today I'll be sharing my top tips for you to bake a great wholemeal loaf at home. If you've been enjoying these bread making tips and you want to start baking great bread from home, then you can download my top bread making tips. I'll let you know more about how to do that at the end of this video. You might already be baking bread at home and now you want to try your hand at wholemeal loaf, or perhaps you've already tried and it just turned out a bit denser and flatter than you were expecting. Well, today I'll be talking about some top tips to prevent that and help you bake a great wholemeal loaf. First of all, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what I mean by wholemeal flour. I've got some in here and I hope you can see that it's got a beautiful creamy colour and it's quite coarse and got lots of bran in it. And that's because to form wholemeal flour, the grain of whichever grain you're using, so it could be wheat, rye, barley, is crushed entirely together. Or when it's being milled, the bran on the outside is stripped off and then added back in to create wholemeal flour. So it's all parts of the grain of whatever cereal grain you're using. The basic setup of a grain is that inside you've got the starchy protein-filled interior called the endosperm, and then you've got the bran outside. And when flour is milled, the starchy interior of the grain forms white flour, and the bran on the outside is only in your flour if you're buying wholemeal flour or some brown flour in less percentage. So the first top tip when you're using a wholemeal flour is that you'll need to adjust the water content of your recipe, because that added bran will absorb a lot more water than just white flour would. And for example, on this dough that I have here, I've used 500 grams of wholemeal flour and I've actually added in 400 grams of water. So that's about 80% as a ratio. Whereas if I was using white flour, I'd only put in about 320 grams of water, or about 64%. So you can see it's quite a big increase in water, and that will be all sucked up by the bran. So it really will absorb a lot more water. So bear that in mind. You won't be able to just switch your white recipe and switch the flour to wholemeal and not make that adjustment of water, because your loaf will turn out very dry and dense. My second tip is to use a pre-soak method. Nothing to do with laundry. This is about adding the flour and water together of your recipe and leaving it to soak. It could be for just an hour, or you could leave it overnight. The reason for doing that is twofold. Firstly, as mentioned, the bran will absorb a lot of water. And actually, when bran is present in your flour, it starts to cut through the developing gluten network in your dough. That gluten is a stretchy protein that forms in your dough and forms the scaffold of your bread. And if the bran is cutting through it, you can see why your dough might end up a bit flatter. So if you do a pre-soak method and allow the bran lots of time to absorb water, it will cut through your gluten network less. In addition, the pre-soak method will also help the formation of your gluten network without there being any mixing or interference from the bran. So the gluten only forms when water is added into flour. And so by doing this method and leaving your flour and water to soak together before adding anything else in from your recipe, you give a chance for that gluten network to form. Once you've pre-soaked the flour and water for however long you do it, then you would add in the salt and the yeast, mix together and knead your dough, and then leave it to rise in the normal way. You might need to give it a little bit longer to rise as well to help your dough develop. My third tip would also be to add a little bit of honey or brown sugar into your recipe. Say just 15 to 30 grams in 500 grams of flour. It'll sweeten up your dough a little bit, yes, and you absolutely don't have to do this if you'd rather not add sugar to your bread. But it helps balance out the flavour of the wholemeal and also feeds the yeast and gives them a little boost as they're producing gas in your dough. So those are my top 3 tips for baking a great wholemeal loaf at home. Add plenty more water, use a pre-soak method, and add in a little honey or brown sugar to sweeten your dough. If you found these bread making tips helpful, then as mentioned, you can download my email series of top bread making tips. You can do that by going to the link in the comments of this video, or by going directly to my website, www.theepsombakehouse.co.uk. I'd love to know if you're baking your own wholemeal loaf at home and whether you found these tips helpful. Please do share what you bake. I love to see what you're baking at home. Otherwise, I'll say bye for now and happy baking.